This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 132, Summer PD Series number 7.
Give them 10 minutes to try to figure out some of this stuff on their own. Then you come in with instruction. Man, it's like you're Yoda coming to them and they're like, yes, I need that. Like, I've been stuck with that. Give it to me.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? I am Ken Erman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here along with my two co-hosts tonight, Mr. Matt and Transition to a new grade level Rogers and Mr. Cory, show 91 Henwood. Thank you so much for coming back with us, Cory. We're looking forward to this conversation. If this is the first time you are listening to our podcast, this is a little bit different than what we do during the school year. We typically have on amazing guests like we had Cory back on show 91. We hear about their passions, their excitements, the things that they do day in and day out in their classrooms and in their position related to education. And we use that to become empowered by what they do on a daily basis. For our summer series, we pivot a little bit and we focus on one specific instructional strategy or one specific topic that we feel is truly important to education to help power you up for your summer as you're ready to get back into a new school year. So for purposes of the conversation, if you've never heard this before, I am currently a secondary instructional coach. I was formerly an elementary STEM teacher and also formerly a fifth grade elementary teacher. So Matt, why don't you say hi and give a quick background on yourself?
All right, so my name is Matt Rogers, and I am a current fourth grade teacher. I was a learning support teacher for fourth and fifth grade for about 5 years, and next year I will be transitioning, hence the nickname, to fifth grade. So Cory, what about you?
Yeah, Cory Henwood, and I'm the Innovation Director in Iron County School District in Southern Utah, and previously served as a principal and math department chair at high school level. And that was kind of my gig before doing what I'm doing now, which largely involves helping new school models and overseeing really anything cool, computer science, digital teaching and learning kind of stuff, all those kind of fun initiatives in our district.
Absolutely. So Cory, I want to throw this to you right off the bat. We're talking about student-centered learning tonight, and it is a definite buzzword in education right now. But I think in education, you always have buzzwords, and there's two types. I think there's buzzwords that are complete fluff and buzzwords that are built off of good foundational instructional practices that may get kind of blurred as it expands and becomes more popular. And I think student-centered learning is without a doubt something that is foundationally really strong. When you think of student-centered learning, especially in your position working K-12 and being in so many different classrooms, how would you define student-centered learning so that any teacher would feel like they could apply it to their own classroom in some way?
Yeah, I like that introduction idea of like taking what are the foundational pieces of just any good piece of instruction and applying it to something that seems a little bit new and maybe scary to many teachers in the idea of student-centered learning. Some of those key pieces that would help me to define student-centered learning start with the teacher, and they start with elements of like teacher clarity, where we've defined what the learning targets should look like. We've defined what the success criteria look like. We've defined some of those pieces with our students, and it's clear to them where they need to go, and then allowing our students kind of the flexibility they need to get there. Maybe that deals with elements of pace, that they can move as quickly as they're able to, or maybe they get some choice over what path they take to get to those learning targets. But it really all starts with establishing those pieces in clarity. And that has a high effect size. Those types of strategies that you might find in visible learning from John Hattie are really the key fundamentals to making student-centered learning work in your classroom. So don't throw away the old for favor of the new. It's a matter of pulling those two things together. And so with the goal of teaching students to be self-directed and to be able to meet and achieve goals. Like that's really something that they can take with them, not just to be successful in your classroom, but also to be successful and self-directed in your life. And I'd be curious to see, with both you and Matt, Ken, your guys' background in elementary, what are some of the pieces you might see, the building blocks, if you will, because that might look different in the high school level where you can give a lot more autonomy than it would in the elementary. What are some of the pieces you might give to start in the elementary level?
So, I mean, I think my goal is to always make the upper grades job harder. So as authentic of an experience I can give my kids in fourth grade, that subject matter experts that probably have a better read of that field in the long term, in that high school realm where they are giving pathways of a lot of kids and saying, hey, if you really excel here, you might want to consider a career in that realm. My goal is to make it as authentic to that as possible, recognizing that they can have the baseline skills, and then the secondary style teacher can go ahead and personalize it to maybe a real world project better than I would, because they have that opportunity to zone totally in and say, now we're looking in the secondary realm for perfection, or as close to that as possible. Refinement, the idea of everything being kind of tidied up. If I get 80% of the project complete with my fourth graders, I'm usually pretty thrilled. Ken, I don't know how you feel about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something that I'm really passionate about. And I think for me, when I think about student-centered learning, because as a coach, as a classroom teacher, it was my bread and butter. It was what I did on a daily basis. As a coach now, I'm in the position of working mostly with middle school and high school teachers and working with every subject, every grade level, special teachers, from STEM to FCS to history classes and English classes. And small group learning is tossed around constantly. I've sat in on interviews as one of the committee, and also when I interviewed for my STEM position and for my coaching position, there was a small group question in there. And I love small group instruction, but that is one facet of student-centered learning, in my opinion. And I think teachers get lost in station rotation, small group learning, choice boards, and they think like that's the core, when that is just one option of how you facilitate it. And for me, it's looking at the content you teach and the learning, like you said, Cory, the learning targets that you have established, and how can the students get there with me being involved in as little as possible of the direct instruction? How can I create opportunities where my students are either exploring the content to figure it out, or working through frustration, or working through real world examples, like you said, Matt? Where is the opportunity for the teacher to step back and truly facilitate the students, insert mini lessons? There's all these different strategies that come with it, but for me, it's about, like you said, Cory, just giving them autonomy and the opportunity to learn it, see if they like it, or just try their best at it, and maybe not do great, maybe do better than you expected. But it's pulling back proactive scaffolds and inserting reactive scaffolds, which typically you always say you should be more proactive than reactive with so many things in life. But I think scaffolding is one of those things where you don't have to be, because if you don't have them there, the kids might rise to the occasion. And so I bring this all back to student-centered learning in the sense that it's the teacher making strategic decisions, like you said, Cory, out of clarity. Where can I step back? Where can I let the kids lead off with this and start running and see what happens, and step in there to support them?
So one of the things, and Ken and I obviously have recorded quite a bit together, but Ken led student-centered learning through his daily instruction, whether it was focusing on math specifically as his subject area that he would create opportunities. He boastfully sent me a text message this week talking about an early observation that talked about how he used something like a ticket in the door to acknowledge who understood the concepts, who didn't, designated who was going off to go do a task independently because they were capable, pulling the kids that needed it, providing those supports, and then getting to an outcome where everyone is accomplishing the day's goal. I think my answer really comes from my philosophy is a little bit different based on, I don't know if it's age or just my style of teaching. My student-centered learning is often through creativity of student choice. That's a little bit different than how I'm instructing my daily classroom. I provide some direct instruction, usually lecture-based up front with outside materials, and then I try to get out of the way as much as possible that they are infusing their own interests with my kind of utilization of benchmark ideas, rubric style instruction that they're working towards. So I just want to kind of clarify that, like, I really struggle. We've talked about this every week about, I see Ken's face light up when our guest comes on and talks about loving student-centered learning. And I still grapple with it. My style of teaching doesn't necessarily lend itself. And it just doesn't bring me as much joy to do, even though I believe that it's super effective. I always struggle with it. Again, every conversation I'm open to changing that perspective, but 100 some episodes in, I'm not quite there. Maybe this new position, I might make that complete switch.
Well, I'm happy you bring up kind of another piece of this idea of student-centered learning, not just around, pacing or demonstrating mastery on targets that are, by defined criteria in your academic daily instruction, like, what you mentioned, but also based on student interests and the ways they would like to demonstrate their evidence of learning and those creative processes that they go through, and really tapping into who your students are through those type of things. Equally important, I'd say, Matt, honestly, like equally important. One of the things that a friend of mine, Kareem Farr, who works at Modern Classroom Projects, he talks about this idea of, I want my students to get the best of me. And he says, when does that happen? When do they get the best of me? Typically, it's when we're working one-on-one, or I'm meeting their needs, exactly what they need when they need it. Not necessarily giving everything to everybody at the same time. And I think the reason I bring that up is when you're talking about how you deliver instruction and how you want to connect and have those kind of moments in your classroom, those memorable moments, maybe as an educator, those things that resonate with you. I wonder if some of those moments that resonate with you already in your practice are similar when you have those kind of one-on-one moments, and giving yourself enough time and space to do that. One method, I'm sure there's many, but one method is to use this type of instruction that is, very data driven, based on what the students need. I'm just picking off what you said about Ken's practice, but, identifying where students are at, giving them just the instruction they need, and giving them the tasks that are appropriate to their level as often as you can. I know that's maybe, that might look different in every classroom, but striving for those types of things are a way to meet your students where they're at and have them get the best of you. And the educators I've seen that have pulled that off often find that it's a big improvement on how much they enjoy their practice as well, because it's them feeling like they're getting the best out of those interactions as well, the most bang for buck, instead of sometimes feeling frustrated and not meeting their students' needs, or feeling like they're banging their head up against the wall. So,
Matt, I want to ask you a question that we haven't talked about before when you talk about this, because I agree with you. Like, it's about doing the best that you can for your students in the style you're comfortable with and the manner you're comfortable with, and what you teach is a huge factor. The age you teach, the subjects you teach, all of those are huge factors. And why I think student-centered learning needs such a broad definition so teachers can find how it applies to their own classroom. How do you measure your success in the way you facilitate? Because you say, I want to give them choice. I want the interest space. You get the idea, and I think you do bring the ideas of student-centered learning to your classroom. But how will you continue to measure your level of success if your opening lecture is the best way to reach that? How will you make sure you're not talking too long, or you're not talking too much, where they are understanding you, especially with your transition into a new grade level? I think you are naturally going to find yourself lecturing longer, because typically when you don't know what you're teaching, or it's the first time, like, I find it myself too. Like, that is the easiest thing to do, is to just deliver instruction. So how are you going to keep a pulse on making sure that you give them the time that you want in those interest and choice based materials?
So I think it's a really interesting question. I want to give one other piece of feedback that I think contributes. So our school district adopted a philosophy known as MCL, Mass Customized Learning. I've talked about it on the podcast before, but in theory, a fourth grader is no longer a fourth grader. They go to homeroom, but that's essentially all they go for. At that point, based off mastery items, they can go to a fifth or sixth grade teacher. They could go down to a second grade teacher. We never got to that level, but in theory, the practice was a student that really struggles with geometry but is great with division can go to the sixth grade level in division in my building, or possibly beyond, but also get support at the third grade level for geometry if that's a skill that they need. And it was based around the idea of 12 to 24 day rotations where the students would receive instruction and then work on competencies to prove that they mastered the skill. If they mastered it, then they would move on to the next concept. If they didn't, they would have a remediation until they got it, or it would kind of push, like the whole building would move from number sense into basic operations, from basic operations into algebraic concepts. Like, as that would move through, and you would have kind of a unification of the teachers, of everyone's trying to stay on pace as much as possible. So, Ken, I think a contributing factor to my definition of student-centered learning often is I have the advantage a lot of times, or in theory, of kids at the same academic level, regardless of their age. So they are all performing relatively at the same level. And so when I can trust that my differentiation is not, I don't want to say critical, like it would have been in a homogeneous grade level or heterogeneous grade level pairing, that really contributed to my nature of being able to do what I need to and then get out of the way, because the entire purpose was performance measures that the students would be able to use to prove mastery of a skill. So I think foundationally, that is a contributing factor. Unfortunately, since COVID, that has become a low priority item that we are still, I think as a career field, trying to scramble to survive and just acknowledge what differences we see in kids and how that contributes. And I think that's where, Ken, to answer your question, I need to be more strategic in not necessarily small group setting, but intentional teaching. And I think intentional teaching is, like you said, putting the responsibility in kids' hands, being one with data. I didn't have to be. It was done for me. When we did these breaks and these pre-tests and post-tests, it self-sorted itself. And so my influence of data has been limited. And I've heard people talk about data, and I'm just like, I don't have to prioritize it. So, Ken, I think really that is going to be a huge shift of saying this needs to be a priority going forward as I look at different attributes. But to be honest, I think in a lot of ways, and this is more my internal challenge, our district adopted a new curriculum 2 years ago for both math and ELA. We are finally getting to the point that universally who you talk to is starting to become fluent, and our admin is giving more permission to try, as opposed to, we first year was work to fidelity, And then second year was integrity, infuse where you feel like you need, but, stick towards the program as much. And now we're finally getting to the point of saying, if PBL makes sense here, if small group instruction and station rotation makes sense, you are finally in the driver's seat to make that decision. And I think that's where a change right now feels really good at the possibility of creating something I'm proud of.
Right. So, Cory, you taught secondary math for a long time.
Yeah.
So, correct. So, the kids coming to you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to assume are at the point where they just expect to show up, be taught at, provided a worksheet. There should be some sort of grade associated with it, and they just want to turn in their work and get their grades. How do you break that mindset of a student? So in the elementary world, I think you're building more of resiliency, and at secondary, you're still trying to do that, but you're also kind of trying to possibly break habit that they've been used to for so long. So as a teacher, you're in it. I get it. I want to do it. This is this instructional style I'm going to go with to make my classroom more student-centered. How do you get the kids to buy into that?
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces to what you've said earlier, like that just resonate to me when we talk about, trying to get to a place where students can, really interact and not just be spoon-fed, but actually seek out and just offer just a right amount of scaffolding and support that they need, right? That's not greeted with a happy face when you throw it out there for the first time. That's like, wait a second, I'm just here. You answer my questions. I give you a quick thing and you tell me, yes, I'm right, or no, I'm wrong, or, I turn it in, I get the points, right? Those kinds of pieces that are ingrained in many of your students. So it starts with messaging. Honestly, it starts with knowing why you're doing what you're doing and then messaging it appropriately to your students, to all the stakeholders in your building, because they're going to hear it. So when I work with teachers on building this type of productive struggle that we see in self-directed learning, right? It's a whole different kind of paradigm for the students and their parents and the teacher across the hall and your administrator in many cases. And so messaging it appropriately is good. I sometimes use stories around, what it looks like to learn to ride a bike. And of course, if I just rode the bike for them all the time, they wouldn't learn anything, right? Or if I were, for example, just to hold them on the training wheels the whole time, even like my one daughter who learned to ride a bike using training wheels, at one point she was just riding like totally sideways, just leaning on one thing the whole time, just crutching on that one training wheel the whole time. And it took finally to just like take them off and let her, I'm going to guide, but she's going to tip over a little bit. And things like balance bikes for me, those are the types of things I want. I want a low risk place for my student that just has just the right amount of scaffolds. They're not going to hurt themselves, not going to be overwhelmed, but they're also going to have to learn to balance on their own. And there's automatic feedback that comes with that little balance bike, and I know when I'm just off. Those are the types of environments I want to create in my classroom. And when I explain it that way to students, parents, stakeholders, they get it. And they realize it's not that I just don't want to answer their kids' questions or come to their rescue every time. It's that I know if I do that, I'm short-circuiting their learning opportunities, both to become self-directed as well as to deeply embed the academics that I'm trying to teach. So those are the types of things I think you need to start with. Then they're willing to buy in or at least try it out a little bit. And then the real game begins, if you will. So
How long can you expect as a secondary teacher, realistically, how long can you expect this type of instruction not to be met with a smiling face from your students?
Yeah. Well, I think until they experience something that they're proud of, like a growth moment, right? Where they realize they did it. And I try to do that collectively with my class. I'll take like a problem that it seems really weighty and cumbersome and it's complicated. And we start out with something that's really like accessible, like we make a guess or something, right? And we try to figure it out together. And collectively as a class, we build off each other's ideas. And ultimately, we get to a place where we're able to narrow down and actually get to an answer that makes sense, if it's mathematics or it's science or whatever. And we've come up with a solution to this problem together. When we've done that as a class, and that initially takes a lot of facilitation and scaffolding from the teacher, and less so as they get used to it. But when we've done that as a class, I make sure at the end I call out and I say, look, we started with something that looked crazy and cumbersome. You had no idea. And now you've gotten us to a point. I didn't do this. I just facilitated what you were saying the whole time. You've gotten to a point where you've gotten something here and you understand it and it makes sense to you now. And they're like, wow. So if they have some of those moments, and some of those are, orchestrated by the teacher, and others you're going to give them in one-on-one moments like we talked about earlier. But the more often they have that, the more willing they are to go a little bit further the next time, right? And just a little bit further. And if what we're seeing, especially in math classrooms, when you talked about my experience here, if what we're seeing instead is students who are willing to try less and less on a math problem because it's either they get it or they don't, right? That's the opposite lesson that we want them to learn as they get further into mathematics. So we're trying to get them to go just a little bit further every time without the scaffolding support spoon feeding, right? And less and less of those scaffolds as they go on. But you got to start where they're at. I mean, wherever they come to you at, and that's the whole idea of student-centered learning. Wherever they come to you, you meet them there, and you go from there to build. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I guess, and this is really posed towards both of you. What was the frequency that you felt like you were achieving what you would consider student-centered learning, whether that's on a daily or weekly basis early on? And what was, like, it's easy to get sold on it, but there's a tremendous amount of work. Ken, I've talked to you time in and time out about how you did so much more work before school and getting there early and getting everything prepared. And then, you're as hands-off as you can be during your day. I think in theory, a lot of us can sell ourselves on the idea of it. What was kind of your entry point into really committing yourself? Because again, I don't think you have to sell anyone on it. But what was that livable balance that you're like, I'm not living for work. I'm not constantly making videos. And I know some of that perfectionism can't exist when you're creating all these materials, but that's something a lot of us strive for. I don't like sending a basic 4-question Google form that looks very boring because they've done it for the last however many days. What is that kind of, I don't know, timeline, or, did you dive straight in, and what were some of the challenges with that as well?
You can go ahead, Cory. I'll follow up with you.
Yeah. For me, I'm kind of a get started, like minimum viable product kind of guy. And for me, before I started with my own transformation, it was a summer of preparing as much stuff as I could, because I also coached at the same time, like I was an athletic coach, and I just knew I wasn't gonna have a lot of time after school and other things. So I put as much as I could together over the course of a summer to find the types of videos, mastery exercises, and classroom activities that I'd want to engage in that would really support this type of approach to learning. And knowing that it wasn't going to be pretty, like there was going to be massive failures here and there, but just like I guess I believed in why I was doing it, and I had seen my own previous shortcomings in the classrooms I had taught in the years previous to that transformation. And I just thought I got to try something different. And so that for me, it was jump in with 2 feet, and I did a lot of prep beforehand. But the nice thing is, and I know this is probably you hear this all the time, but I didn't feel like I was always constantly working on it all the time. Eventually I got to a point where I could do less of that kind of prep work and just focus my time really on my students and their needs, and trying to meet those instead of always prepping all the student-centered kind of learning materials. Eventually I got to a place where that was mostly set, So
can I add an additional question, Ken, before you answer? I work in a really collaborative environment. And this is something that if you're going to commit to these style lessons, like I feel like you have to be full in. And when you're building materials, expecting that they're going to be shared, was that also a consideration? Was that something that you felt like, I have to prioritize my classroom, so I'm going to build a lesson that works for my kids, which I think is the easy, straightforward answer, but there's also some obligation. Like, I worked with my wife for 9 years. The things that I made, my wife needed to use for our sanity of having a relationship outside of work, and vice versa. So was there any features, Cory, where you were working with anyone on a grade level team or whatever the case may be, that influenced how you were creating things as well?
The first go around I had, which is what I was referring to before, that wasn't the case. I was kind of given the permission to be like the lone pilot on this, because I don't know if many people were willing to go along at that time. This is a number of years ago. But, for example, some of the things I found most success in recently supporting schools and school models with this has been in collaboration and building that together. But that takes like a collective vision that you all are on the same page, so, if you can find that in somebody, certainly better. One, the product's going to be better. You're going to be able to say, hey, this is what we want together. And I'm not going to forget something that you're going to bring up to me and say, hey, what about this? Those types of things are going to make it much better. And so if you can get to a place where collaboration's part of it, then you're in real good shape. And if you just need to go it alone, then you're gonna have ups and downs like you will in any other setting. But I think it's always worth giving it a go one way or the other. And certainly, team is always better if you have that opportunity. So.
Yeah, for sure. And so to answer your first question, Matt, about frequency, that's a loaded question, I think, because if you looked at where I was in year 2 of teaching versus year 7 of teaching 5th grade, it was incredibly frequent as I exited 5th grade, because every year I did more and more. And so I will often say to teachers, this is where it can go. Let's set some initial goals of where we can start. But know that as you build momentum, you will start to implement it at a quicker pace more frequently, because you become more confident in the style of teaching. You also become more confident in management strategies. Your students become more competent. And if I were to teach 2nd grade next year, my frequency of student-centered learning would be much less than when I was teaching 5th, but I would reach a higher frequency quicker, because I understand how to do it and the why and all the pieces, but the content is where I would need to have a better experience. I would need to know, what does it actually look like when I teach theme to 2nd graders? Like, what do they know? What do they not know? What is the typical student? So you kind of have to have that content experience with that particular age level, or as a secondary teacher with a particular course. But in terms of the prep work, there's a million ways that you could make this a lot of prep work. And there's also really simple ways you can make it no prep work. So for example, so you talked about my 2014 observation for my 2nd year. I'm going to read that comment that I sent to you. Teacher used a short pretest prior to the lesson to determine prior knowledge. He created 2 groups based on the pretest, those who understood the concept and those who needed direct instruction. Students in the first group were given the assignments to do independently in the back of the room, which were directly correlated to our program, while teacher gave direct instruction to the 2nd group. As the students in the group receiving direct instruction completed their work, they were directed by the teacher to complete the same independent activities, and then he checked in with the first group. Like, that is no new material created other than the quick assessment, which was probably like 3 questions. It was, you guys already know this, go do the independent work that was going to be the follow-up of the direct instruction lesson. You guys don't know the material like you're not supposed to as a 5th grader. Here's your direct instruction. Now go do your work. Now let me check in with the first group, and I'll throw some challenge work at them while I have them in small group. So that is a no prep student-centered learning database instruction lesson. Another simple example, writing class, elementary, secondary, I don't care what it is. What do we want to give kids the time to do? We want to give them time to write. Well, you don't have to give all of your students time to write at the same time. If you're looking to provide some sort of instruction on grammar, on in-text citations, on strong introductions, group your kids based on writing you've seen before and have 75% of your students write while you meet with a small group, and do that over the course of 3 days if you have writing time that they need to have in class. So I really think that you can simplify it in the sense that you just look at your students and say, do they all need the same thing right now? A lot of times the answer is no. Okay, so how can I just use the same work that they always do, but have them do it in a different order? How can they just do it before my direct instruction or after my direct instruction based on their level of need? As far as the collaboration piece, when I started, I was only teaching math to the whole grade level myself, so I didn't have to. When I started being non-departmentalized, I collaborated a lot with my colleagues, especially for reading, because the two other teachers were much stronger reading teachers than me. And so I was able to help show them strategies for student-centered groupings and the framework. And they helped me become a much better reading teacher at the same time.
I'm just going to keep on asking questions, but I hope that's all right. So I think one of the biggest limitations that I think of, hopefully, someone in the audience feels the same way, is what are you doing with kids actively when you are meeting with them? And I'll use, Ken, your example, because I think it's really relatable. It's pretty obvious what you're doing with the group that doesn't get it initially. And it's pretty obvious what materials you may have as your end result, whether that's a worksheet or whatever the case may be, that may be provided from your program. We can all find that. One of the things that I think tricks a lot of us up is, what are you doing with that group that gets it when you're meeting with them? Obviously, you're confirming, did they really understand the concepts? Obviously, that means you're going over the independent work. But I think one of the biggest fears about student-centered learning is, if you're only repeating the same instruction they could have gotten, are you actually utilizing it? If you're only checking, same type scenario. If you're bringing new material, are you bringing in next grade level material or next day material? Because both of those feel a little overwhelming as well, to say, I'm a fifth grade teacher, but I'm also partially preparing myself for sixth grade, or I'm a third grade teacher, I'm kind of participating as if a fourth grader is in my classroom. So I don't want to, my fear, I think, if I'm conveying this the right way, is, am I extending that gap that we don't want by acknowledging necessary scaffold? And where are you pulling those materials from to feel like you're pulling quality, grade level, appropriate to standards enrichment for these kids?
So I'll jump in there first. So I think that's a great question. First of all, spot on with the first group. Yeah, you're pretty much, if you have a scripted program, which a lot of you have, or something where it's really guiding your instruction, that first group that you're meeting with, you're just doing what you're supposed to do with the whole class, just with that group, right? And you can do it a little bit slower. You can use some manipulatives. You can make it a little bit more, you can make it a much more successful lesson, because you don't feel like you have to go a little bit faster because kids are bored. So that's that group. With the second group you're meeting with, you should not be doing direct instruction, because they've already shown that they don't need it. And then again, like you said, Matt, it would be inefficient with your time. Jump right into practice, right into check, and then see, are they where you thought they were? Are they a little bit behind, or are they missing some pieces? And then you can insert targeted direct instruction, like, oh, don't forget about this, or this is a neat trick. Like, let's try to see how this helps with your process, or checking your work, or those different things that you can mix in. As far as the enrichment, next day, next year, I think there's layers of that in both. So let's take math, for example. I consulted with a school this year, and I was doing adding and subtracting decimals with fifth grade classroom in the beginning of the year. I had a group of students who all I taught in my small groups was adding decimals. However, my last group I met with had already shown that they know how to add and subtract decimals, regardless of how large they were, regardless of the uneven digits. So when I met with them, I challenged them on adding and subtracting decimals. So the next day, if I were in that classroom again, I would not meet with that group because I've already covered Monday and Tuesday lesson with them. And now I can circle back and work with those other groups longer. And so, yes, it raises the question, well, what do they do the next day? Yes, you have to find ways to challenge, and the challenging and enriching is probably much harder than the supporting of your lower level students. But the other thing is being very intentional with skill-based groupings. You're not just saying, these are my high kids, these are my mid kids, these are my low kids. It should constantly change, and that allows you to kind of keep everybody a little bit tighter knit. If you're in a humanities class, meet with small groups to talk about their strengths and how to make them stronger. So your small group on writing could be, hey, the 5 kids you have with you, you are all really great at writing introductions. Let's read ones that you have and talk about what makes your introduction so great. I want to focus on this so you don't stop doing it, right? So sometimes that can be your direct instruction with higher kids on a particular topic, is to reinforce those strengths that they have.
Yeah, I would say, I love self-pacing structures as much as probably anybody, but I know they're overwhelming for a lot of teachers, to have students moving on to places where I'm not ready for them to be in a different place. And sometimes if you want to go down that route, you might say, hey, there's some option to self-pace throughout these topics in the course of a week or in the course of a couple weeks if you wanted to, and try to give some endpoints so that students aren't way, all over the place. And then what do they do when they are ahead, or when they're ahead of where you need to be? And this could be either with that second group during that lesson, or it can be, when students get more time, maybe towards the end of that week or 2-week period, giving them some time to sink into a really meaningful problem, something that's interesting, something that's worth discussing, whether that's in the humanities or whether that's in your mathematics instruction, right? It's something that you might want to dive into a little bit deeper. I use a lot of 3-act tasks in mathematics that really allow students to dive into those types of problems, and those can be done in a short period of time. Or I also enjoy, design thinking type of projects with my students to really dive into like solutions and make their learning more deep. And what you said earlier, Matt, when you like to give choices and you like to give extensions based on their interests and those types of things earlier, I think you could leverage those elements. Students could spend more time and go deeply. Those types of projects or complicated problems can really be an accordion of time. Like they could be, as short as you have time for, or you can go way deep into those and spend a lot of time. And for me, that's kind of that flexible accordion that allows for the time that you need to get all students to where you want them to be and proficient, and allow the students who have reached that level more quickly to demonstrate areas of competency in deeper learning or other types of tactics. Instead of like always just moving on to the next thing, they're going deeper into the topics that you've discussed. And I think that might be a reasonable strategy for a lot of folks.
I think another barrier really comes down to specifically the age range, obviously, but I mean that more so, Ken, you talked about departmentalizing. And I don't know if we have to get into if you are pro or con, but at least from the elementary level, it is not necessarily a common practice to departmentalize. Yet when we kind of sit here and say, I think we all agree that student-centered learning is a benefit, but to grasp 4 content areas to a level that you have remediation materials on grade level materials and the creativity to come up with meaningful extension materials just feels really daunting. Do you feel like, considering giving support to a teacher that is teaching multiple subject areas, would you diversify your early efforts amongst like one lesson or a few lessons in math, a few lessons in science 2 or 3 weeks later as they get acclimated, or dive into one subject area and really, I'll use, again, you're not selling someone on this being a good idea. I think it's different than, oh, do my kids love it? I think the hard part is when you witness your kids loving it and you want to provide it, but you don't want to work 80-hour work weeks to make that a reality, or become so fluent with, all these different subject areas. Cory, what would your advice be? I mean, I'm sure you have some connection to that with your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's best to get started somewhere, wherever that is. Maybe that's one subject. For a lot of teachers, I feel like this idea of data-driven instruction, targeted instruction, tends to follow in the math and sciences a little easier for a lot of teachers. They just feel like, but that's not. I don't want to. Maybe that's just my own characterization of what I've seen, but that's certainly a place to start. The other place that I've seen folks get into a lot of more deeper learning when they're looking for those types of extensions has occurred maybe in a science or a STEM environment, where they're saying students are going to dive more deeply into this, come up with a varied types of solutions. And that can tie into some of the reading that they need to do on research or background information as well. Like, and tie several of these content areas together with some sort of a project that says, hey, you're going to do some reading, some research here on some nonfiction grade level material, and then you're going to access this problem, and you're going to come up with solutions, models, and a lot of times that looks like it's applying maybe the more standards that, like when you look at mathematics, the standards of mathematical practice, or the science and engineering practices that you'll see in the national science standards. I think those are the types of things that you'll see more readily than you will like a particular content standard. And if you can get to that place where you're not feeling too much in a box, eventually that's a great place to be. But to start, you just start with what you have in front of you. And I think whatever is the most accessible for you. For me, it would have been mathematics, because that was where my comfort was. I've seen, I work with a literacy coach in one of the programs I oversee. And for her, she was able to do it in her literacy instruction because that's where she was most confident. And I think wherever you're most capable and confident, you start there, you see the benefits, and you grow slowly from there.
I want to reiterate the feeling most confident. I think that's so important, because it allows the teacher to focus their energy on figuring out, what does this look like now, and not figure out how to teach it. I say to teachers constantly, if you've been in a grade level for multiple years as an elementary teacher or secondary teacher, if you've been teaching a specific course for a while, whether it's biology or algebra or, U.S. history from this time period to this time period, if you've been doing that for a while, I could stick you in any classroom in this country that is that same course, and you could teach those kids that day in that moment. I could say, this is the lesson, this is the concept they're learning today, and they could walk right in and do it. And so if the class that you have that feeling in, that is a great place to start, because you won't have to waste your energy on figuring out how to teach the kids the content. You'll figure out how to group the kids, organize the learning environment to, if you're not doing small group, organizing the learning environment. So that's where you can put your energy towards. As far as more specifically where to start, I was making some notes as you were talking about this. So math and reading, I think, is a great place to start for small group instruction, if that's kind of the mindset you want to go with, because the kids typically are on different levels. And so even going down a little bit further, if you just want to try this a couple times, think about the time in the year where you say, oh, man, these next 3 days are tough. These kids are all over the place. That is the perfect time to try it. Reading, the advantage I think you have there is I think the data is a little more stagnant. And what I mean by that is, as you progress through math in a school year, the kids' ability to tackle the next concept changes. And so I think it's more important to assess your students more regularly. Whereas with reading concepts, and this is elementary or secondary, like they get theme or they don't get theme. they get main idea, they don't get main idea. Like those things stay a little, like if you test them in the beginning of the year, if you haven't talked about theme from the time you did that test, your data on theme is probably very accurate or at least good enough to group them off of that. So
and to add to it, obviously the story is so dependent. Prior knowledge, interest level, those type features can absolutely skew.
Exactly.
Which makes it tough.
Exactly. So it gives you something maybe where you don't have to assess them as often. Science and social studies, secondary teachers, or when this is one of your 4 subjects as an elementary teacher, like I think that's a perfect place to just let the kids explore and experience, identify phenomena, experience and see things, or run with a project. Like say, here's what I want you to research, or here's what I want you to learn about, and we're going to organize it in some sort of creative project. So I think it's a little bit easier to run with less prep. And even like something like FCS, right? Cooking class. Figure out if your kids have cooked before. Figure out if they've baked before. Like some kids are probably amazing bakers because they do it at home with their family. And if you have a group of them, give them the lesson or give them the recipe and ignore them for the rest of the class. Like just let them go and see if they can do it on their own. Right. I mean, obviously keep them safe, but like just let them go for it. And there's a really simple way to assess if they were good or not. Does it taste good? Like, does your brownie taste good or does it taste like crap? Like there's your assessment. And for the kids that have not had experience baking, now the teacher can focus more with them and talk about, okay, let's look at the recipe. This is measurement, like this flour versus sugar. We measure these differently. Here's why let that direct teach them a little bit more, because you can let your more experienced kids go off on their own. So I really just think it's about looking at, like you said, Cory, your own strengths as a teacher, and then also where can I best fit this to benefit my students who are on different levels.
I'm sorry to keep on asking questions, but I have another one that's really pressing to the front of my head. The common line, work smarter, not harder, comes up as educators. And Cory, you made a comment about how you spent a very intentional amount of time over the summer to gather materials, especially with the amount of resources that are available to us these days. Some good, some less than good. What are maybe some tried and true resources that you go to that you feel like are vetted and are close enough? Because, or let me I guess make that generalization. A lot of us feel like we need to record it, we need to make it, we need to have it done for us to feel comfortable to show it to our kids. Are there any tips or strategies if you feel that insecurity that you need to do it? Or if you are going outside of yourself, are there certain places or things that you're researching and referencing? Because I can make a connection on Twitter and find something. It's probably not going to be a consistent source, or I can generate an idea, but it may not match my grade level. There's so many factors that it's still, there are so many ways to justify it not working more so than working. So kind of speak to that experience. Were you impassioned to build your own? What are you looking for when you're, 90% of this activity is good, but 10% is a little bit off, but that's forgivable. Well, what's your vetting process?
Yeah, that's a challenging situation to be in, and I was certainly there that summer. When I was really digging into everything and for the first time. So much so that I think that's when I first started creating a website of these resources to be like, look, if you're like me and you're wondering where to find stuff that seems good, that's a lot of Googling. That's a lot of, internet searching and going through and trying things out and vetting. And I ended up finding some great resources for my math classroom. Some of those that came from, the math assessment resource, others from those that were kind of initially into the 3-act math stage of things for some of the activities I wanted from Dan Meyer. and others. But I found that that's a challenge that I started with, for example, a lot of like Khan Academy type videos. And I don't know if there's anything wrong with any of those, but I have found that teachers who create their own imperfect videos for instruction and their own exercises, those tend to be seen with a lot different perspective from their students than those that I've pulled in from somebody that they don't know. And maybe that's not music to the ears of those looking to say, well, where can I find stuff? And so I don't need to build it. But I just think that that's true. And I ended up finding for the teachers that I've worked with, and as well as myself, those things that they've made, and they're not perfect. They're like 2-minute quick record, start talking like you were talking to anybody else. If you mess up, stumble, you just say, oh, well, sorry. And you keep going just as if you were live with a person. They don't need to be perfect. And I think that's something that's reiterated with some of the folks I see doing great work in this area, like Modern Classrooms I referenced earlier. That's a pillar of theirs. And I think that is important to the work, not to be overly critical of your own work as you put together some of these resources. Some of them are gonna be great, some of them are gonna flop, and you'll change them out over time. But there are, depending on your content area, you'll be able to find some things that you can go to. But it is hard to find. No way sugarcoating it.
Finding resources is probably one of the most dreadful things that we do as teachers, because you want something that's perfect for it. You want it to be free, and those two commonly don't exist. As far as videos specifically, as Matt, as you know, I've made hundreds of screencasts and videos for my students. But I will tell you that I never made a grammar video, and I used Khan Academy for all of my flipped grammar instruction that I did throughout the year, because I ran out of time. It just wasn't realistic for me to make. It's probably the worst thing that I have as far as content knowledge in my teaching practice. And you know what? The videos were so short and so simple that it was good enough. And the students knew that I was still making an effort because I had so many others of my own. And I think that's a healthy balance, at least, where you can say, yeah, I make some of my own, but hey, listen, this guy teaches this so much better than I could. I'm just going to have you watch it because I watch it every year because it helps me learn too, right? So you can kind of flip those things in that way. But I would really encourage you to look at the resources you already have and just change your mindset about how you approach it. Look at it and say, can I just let the kids try this on their own? Like if I have a lab that we do, I said this to a chemistry teacher who was struggling with this. She wanted her students to be more engaged with the labs. And I said, can you tell me every lab where the students can't hurt themselves? Like seriously hurt themselves? Because as a chemistry teacher, they are doing things that, like, if they don't do it right, it could actually be a very, very big deal. And she said, yeah, we have this one, and this one. I said, perfect. Give them the lab and walk away. Just let them try it and see how it goes. See what it feels like. Because the worst thing that's going to happen is like a kid might burn himself on a Bunsen burner, right? They're not mixing chemicals that can become explosive or can become very dangerous. So just look at what you have and just ask, where can I just step back and just let the kids try it and then insert my instruction? Can I just let them go for 10 minutes and then do my direct instruction lesson? Maybe I can let them go for 10 minutes and then do my direct instruction lesson with only half of them or only a third of them, or maybe all but 2 of them, right? But just use what you have and just change the way you approach the lesson, whether it's grouping them or just letting them all try it. But I just can't encourage them enough there's not this like magic pill of resources out there to make this work better. It's the mindset of how we trust our students to go for it and allow them the time and space to do that.
Yeah, this is really more about approach than it is about the right resources. And just contrasting the approach of like, I'm going to teach you and guide you through this lab, and how you'll have some students interested, some intrigued, some not at all interested or listening to what you say, and then ask you to repeat the instructions 15 times, later, right? Versus you give them 10 minutes, like you said, Ken, give them 10 minutes to try to figure out some of this stuff on their own. Then you come in with instruction, man, it's like you're Yoda coming to them and they're like, yes, I need that. Like, I've been stuck with that. Give it to me. And they soak it in. It's just so much more powerful. They're getting the best of you, as we talked about earlier. That's really part of this is, figuring out another thing that Doug Finn mentioned to me one time we were talking about this is, just this idea of find out what your students don't know and then teach it to them. Sounds really simple, but that is kind of the flip in the approach, right? Instead of I'm going to teach and then figure out what you don't know. And so anyway, just a different approach, different philosophy. And that's as simple as you can start it with trying to tap into what students don't know and teaching it to them. There's a whole other series of tools if you're looking to go deeper than that. I really like some of the stuff that Ed Elements has put out around their Core 4 personalized learning, when it's, this idea of student ownership and reflection as a part of personalized or student-centered learning, having them own their own learning. Where am I versus the target, reflecting, setting goals, and then using, another piece they mentioned are, flexible content and tools so that I can flexibly move and have tools that meet me where I'm at. Those are pieces of it, but the other two, which we've spent a lot of time on, are data-driven instruction and targeted instruction. Those two pieces, I think, are part of what we, a great place to start when it comes to student-centered learning. So
I've got one more resources question, and then I will retire myself. So one of the main resources that we often feel influenced to use is other personnel from your school. And I think that is one of the features that I am allowing to be a barrier of diving completely in. I work with a wonderful set of tutors that pop in, usually at a half an hour at a time. Unfortunately, it is one of those scenarios that if there is needs elsewhere in the building, they are not by choice always reliable. So using that, I'll first go from the point of view, Ken, of you have a group you're working on one-on-one, and there's a group that is already got it, and then you're meeting with that group. I think it's pretty obvious you can put the tutor with the group that you're not with, whether that's monitoring or providing, prompting to continue working, the group that didn't get it before, reassurance. But how do you feel like you can, or I guess I'll say, do you feel like to sufficiently do this, you need to be the one providing that scaffolding to that lower group or the extension? Or did you ever utilize outside support to be your way to say, she checked in or he checked in with that group, said they actually got it, led them into the next activity, they confirmed all the answers were correct? How much do you feel like you needed in that 15 minutes to be the source, or did you ever allocate outward to additional support?
That's a great question, Matt. I love that. So the answer is yes. I at times I had a teaching assistant in my room for the special ed students that I had included in my classroom, and I 100% leveraged them. And when you're working with teaching assistants who truly are like the lifeblood of a school to keep everything afloat at times, it does require us as teachers to mentor them depending on where they're coming from, what experience they have as a teaching assistant, the types of students that you have in your classroom. Those are all factors. But I was very clear with them on what they were supposed to be doing when they were sitting down with a group of students, which was typically the lower students at times, but not always, just because they were there to work with some particular students. But they weren't always working with those particular students because sometimes I needed to be with them. But I was very, very clear with them on what the purpose of this activity was, and also to say to them, I don't want you to help them until they get to this point, right? Because teaching assistants are amazing at helping kids. That is what they do every day. And so, again, their mindset needs to be changed. And it's, I had ones that I worked probably 6 years with, and by year 3, year 4, they were totally in sync with how I was doing things. In the beginning, it was a struggle, and I did provide them feedback, like, listen, thank you so much for working with them. I love having you here, but next time, can you just wait a little bit longer? Can you just let them struggle a little bit more? And what you were talking about earlier, Cory, that like that aha moment for your students, it's the same for them. Like once they got it, and then they were totally in sync with using that. So if you have extra resources, especially adults in your room, absolutely leverage them, but be on the same page with what the goal is of the students that they're working with.
We just want to help, Ken. That's just what we want to do.
Yeah.
Educators who just want to help people and figuring out what is the way that I can provide the most help for the student, not just the immediate, like, here's the answer to that, obviously, or here,
or you made a mistake here,
yes,
you missed
this
that.
is the next step. Yep. I did this so many times, man. Oh, hey, you're struggling with this. Let me just pick up your pencil and show you. And I pick up a student's pencil and I start, you know what I mean? Like, no. And it's because we're helpful folks, and just takes a little bit of training, feedback, working together on it, having the same goals, being vulnerable, opening up when I don't do it right either. Like, you don't want to be the person that the teaching assistant is like, well, that's this know-it-all. I go in there, and you know what I mean. So you're working together on it. Nobody's perfect, and you're working together, and but you're coming up with that same goal. And I think part of that is the messaging piece I talked about before, the coming up with a collective vision together. What does learning look like in here? And if that can be collaborative, that process of building that, in particular with those who work in your classroom, then all the better, right? If you're designing exactly what it needs to look like without any of their input, that comes off a little bit differently too. So if you can pull in their experience and their input into how it's going to look in their classroom, all the more better. And then you'll have a place where you can both work in that kind of symbiotic nature. So
yeah, absolutely. And if it was a co-teacher, obviously my message would have been much different, much more of a collaborative planning piece. But I love that you mentioned that, Cory, because there were times now I'm thinking about where I would say, once you work with these students, try not to give them a whole lot of help. I'm trying to figure out how well they know this. But I want you understand this well. You know how students learn this well. Let me know at the end of class, where are they at, right? So then we would collaboratively talk at the end. What do you think we need to do with them tomorrow? And she might say, well, they just need to practice more. Like they're really close. Or I really think they don't get it at all. Like they need more help, right? So it was that like collaborative piece where I'm valuing her feedback, but still setting this is the goal, right? So I think that's really important. So we're kind of running out here on time, but Cory, is there anything else that you think we truly need to hit on, whether it's student mindset, teacher mindset, or just approach into how to get the ball rolling with student-centered learning?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that we've left out is about how to get started. I feel like you both have made this really approachable for any teacher, that it's just a matter of getting started with the resources you have or that can quickly be available, finding out where your students are at, giving them the instruction they need just in time, not stepping in when it's, when we feel like we need to step in, maybe just hold off a little bit, just provide just the right amount of scaffolds. One of the things that I think is worth diving into at some point for those who want to take on those types of student-centered projects, things that involve students' interest and creativity, are providing the types of processes that allow your students to dive into that work without necessarily always indicating what does the product look like. Allowing them to have some choice over what does the product look like, but maybe defining, hey, you could use one thing that's been successful for me anyway is using, I mentioned the design thinking process as something that develops both the competencies I want to see in my student, those more transferable skills, around creativity and using critical thinking and feedback and coming up with solutions, without defining what the actual work needs to look like without saying, hey, this is what I want to see at the end of it. Go through this process and let's see what comes out of it. is an interesting, just a different take on a totally different take on where you might be with academics, where you're like, this is what I want to see. When you've mastered this, this is what it will look like. You can go whichever way you want to get there. It's almost a different take on that. So that's just a different tangent that someone could dive into if they were looking for, how do I develop those types of competencies? How do I use the interests of my students in the classroom more effectively to get to a place where they've deeply understood both the content as well as been able to apply it in a way that builds these other essential skills in their students. But it's just a matter, like we've been saying, just get started. Get started with where you're at, where you're comfortable, and jumping in and enjoy the ride, because it's a lot of fun working with students in this more targeted way, and meeting their needs will feel a lot more fulfilling. And it's really why a lot of us get into teaching, is we want to meet the needs, help our students, like we've been saying. Just going about it a different way is part of what student-centered learning is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that piece of like the design thinking and the exploring and choice and passions and things, is look at the span that it's going to last and what your typical lessons would be, and the content that you feel you need to teach the kids, and just have ways of knowing whether or not they get that, right? So how are you going to assess whether or not they understand these 5 vocabulary terms or these 3 concepts? And if they get it, great. Like, they might figure it out on their own. They might already know it, or through the research of the project, they might understand that, right? And if they don't, that's when you do your lesson. Whatever you always did, you say, okay, these 5 kids, they're struggling with this right now. I'm going to pull them over and we're going to talk about this. Or you have checkpoints built in. And when they reach a certain checkpoint, then you do the lesson. So you might be doing it a couple times, but you can usually simplify it and make it a little bit shorter because you're working with less. And so when they reach those points, that's when you insert that content mini lesson, just to help them still hit those learning targets that you had. Just might be at a different pace, or might be in a different order depending on what you're doing. So Cory, thank you so much for coming back and joining us. Can you remind our audience just how they can get in touch with you or follow along with you?
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I'm glad I was able to come back and mix it up with you guys. I really have enjoyed it. Yeah, I'd love to stay connected with folks. If you can find me on Twitter, is where I'm probably most active, is at Cory Henwood on Twitter, or you can find my website at www.coryhenwood.com. So I'd be happy to connect with you and share ideas. I love connecting with educators and helping where I can. We've been talking about just our willingness to help as educators, and that's certainly the case. I promise I won't wait and let you struggle for a certain amount of minutes before I step in and help. You just reach out, and I'm happy to help you. That's what we're here for, help each other. So
awesome. Thank you so much. I'll link up to that on our show notes, which can be found if you just scroll down wherever you're watching or listening, or on our website at powereduup.com. So Cory, thank you again so much. If you have not already, please consider subscribing to this podcast. Check out the rest of our summer series that we have for the 2023 summer. And then we have another slew of amazing guests coming back in for the fall. So Matt, thank you as well. And why don't you take us on out of here?
As we get ready to power down this episode, guys, I think we've left everyone feeling pretty powered up. A little parting message: grace. This is definitely a topic where grace is super key. I think it is really easy for me to be sitting here saying I should be doing more student-centered learning. I think it's easy to be on your side, guys, of having more experience of classic student-centered learning and saying, oh, I can't keep up. But anything that you do in this direction, we know is good for kids. So the little bit more that you did that you didn't do before or weren't intending to, that grace is what you have to give yourself, because it's going to pay dividends. So yeah, absolutely.
Amen.
Yeah, it's not going to go perfect. So on that note, Cory, Ken, thanks for the time, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.